You've probably seen the debate between MCP versus CLI. One side says MCP is the new standard, the other says skip the server and use the CLI, but both point to the same tools. When you look at the top MCP list in 2026, you'll see GitHub, Playwright, File System, but rarely do you see a top developer using any of these MCPs. And in these lists, you'll also see the comments ask why their CLIs are not working. You might be wondering, should you replace the dozen of MCPs you've already installed a year ago? And if you're building a new tool, which one should you ship? The answer depends on what changed after MCP Won. We'll answer both of those and more in this video. Now you're wondering, who am I? I'm Andy. I've built and shipped a dozen of CLIs, MCPs, internally and externally, as well as a suite of other tools for Mac, iOS, and some MCPs that I built over time for my company, Snowflake MCP, Slack MCP, Confluence, Hex, and I also have my own Slack and Google open source CLIs that you can look and use as well. Because it's easier to build than ever, choosing MCP or CLI is mostly trivial now. And over time, I've migrated all my MCP usage to CLI, and maybe you should too. AI is evolving rapidly, and what is true 3 years ago, a year ago, might not be true anymore today. And so it's useful to look back in 2022 when ChatGPT was launched, and then a year later, Cursor was launched in 2023, and how some of these tools, such as MCPs, skills, and CLIs have evolved and grown with respect to that. From using AI in a chat window to using AI with a computer, things have evolved. What made sense then might not make sense now. At the end of 2024, MCP was launched, and shortly a year later, Skills was launched. But agents and models didn't get really good until the end of 2025 when Opus 4.5 came out. And that's when the paradigm changed, where you could trust agents with computers to actually execute work on your behalf without you having to watch it. And then shortly after, OpenClaw broke the internet in January 2026. And that was when the flood of agent-native CLIs started to happen. The creator of OpenClaw, Peter, started the movement, a lot of CLIs that were agent-native. And with models improving rapidly, MCPs are not evolving at the same rate. A year ago, agents were pre-trained and post-trained on terminal work. And today, they're now also pre and post-trained on agent-native CLIs at a much higher volume because humans use them as well. And so CLI might give you better performance. And for most day-to-day work on your computer, the CLI is a now sensible default. But you might not have caught up with that. If we look on Reddit, you can see the comments reaching the same practical conclusions. And if you've built an MCP yourself, you'll know how hard it is to inspect and tune. It can sometimes feel like a black box. But to understand what changed, we first need to understand why MCP won. So briefly, what is a MCP server and what is a CLI? MCP stands for Model Context Protocol, and it is an open standard, and you can think about it as like a common plug that helps AI apps connect to outside tools and data. And a CLI stands for Command Line Interface. A CLI is an app that accepts commands in the terminal. You type a command instead of clicking a button, and then your agents can also run the same commands. In 2024, every app rebuilt every integration. AI lived in separate applications, and each app had to rebuild access to every service it wanted to use. You had ChatGPT, and you wanted ChatGPT read a message from Slack, send an email for Gmail, create a ticket in Jira, or update a document in Notion. And if you're one of these providers, instead of having an agent learn how to do that each time, it made sense for Slack to build that MCP server so that any of these applications, whether that be ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude Code, can all read the Slack messages that you authenticated to. Shortly after, Anthropic introduced MCP, a standard protocol, in order to replace that custom connection with one shared standard. You could build each tool connection once, and every AI application can reuse it. MCP solved the right problem at the right time, and it's still evolving. MCP won in 2025. OpenAI first adopted it, and then Google. And anytime you had an IDE that needed to leverage some tools, you use MCP to connect to it. Then agents moved onto our computers. Claude Code, ChatGPT, now branded as Codex, gain access to the terminal. They can use the same command line tools that we use every day. MCP gave AI a plug because it had no computer. Many agents have a computer today, and that changes which tools should be the default. But over time, as you moved a lot of your agentic work from chat windows onto your computer or moving away from your IDE into the terminal, MCP no longer made sense. They initially worked really well, and over time, you found more issues, more bugs. It didn't connect in the right way. Sometimes it was slow and clunky and agents didn't know how to use it. MCP was the default when the models were bad, but the models are good now. They can write bash and run CLI commands well, and now CLIs might be a better default for you. 2026 is different. Your agent got a computer. Skills was introduced shortly after. It's crazy to think that it's only been a half year since Opus 4.5 came out and everything changed. But when you zoom out, MCP and CLIs are not that different. They both wrap an API, but they show up differently. One is a fixed menu that's loaded into every conversation, and the other is a toolbox that's battle tested for decades, and the models grew up on it. At the time, the execution layer was missing, and so MCP had to build the execution layer in the browser. But now ChatGPT and Claude, they both ship with computers in the browser as well. If you're on a team account or pay for a subscription, ChatGPT comes with their own virtual machine that gives your agent access to a computer. That's the direction that we're moving in. But it's not limited to just the terminal anymore. With Claude and ChatGPT both having desktop applications with Claude Cowork or Codex, you can now use CLIs also in those applications. CLI is a maintain execution layer, and it lives exactly where the agent lives. And the most common one is the GitHub CLI. Because the GitHub CLI had to exist before AI, it's been used by millions of developers and has been battle tested as well as pre-trained with models. And so they'll know how to use that much more effectively than the GitHub MCP. And the terminal move was only half the change. A few months later, CLIs started to become designed for agents, pre-trained for agents. We didn't have the right frameworks for CLIs quite yet, and the missing link was skills. Whether you have a CLI before the AI era or a CLI that was specifically designed and built for agents natively, skills can bridge the gap between both. One of my most used CLIs in the agent era is Vercel's agent browser CLI that has a discovery stub as a skill that allows an agent learn about all the details and quirks about how to use a CLI for different use cases that's directly bundled into the CLI so that the discovery stub just acts as a way for the agent to know when to trigger it. And then it can discover the rest of the commands in the terminal as it needs it. A well-designed skills will allow you to bundle many guides, use case specific skills into the CLI. So as they change and evolve, they still work with the CLI that you have installed. So you might be wondering why use a CLI or why start with a CLI. And because every company is releasing their own harness, their own agent, you're no longer just using one agent where you install the MCP once. A year ago, you might have just used Cursor or VS Code. But today, you might be using Codex, Claude, Grok. With a CLI, to make it easier for all your agents to get the tools that it needs, you can install it once and every agent gets it. You can set up one brain where you have your skills, your rules, so that any agent gets it. And it's much easier to set up a CLI once so that all your agents can use it, whether that be Hermes, OpenClaw, or that new harness that gets released each week. The MCP that you built a year ago might not be compatible with those anymore. When I built some MCPs internally for Claude Code, when we shifted to open code, it was no longer compatible, integrate. But because CLIs are built not just for agents, but also for humans, the integration can be much easier. And so it's easier to version control and make sure that any agent that is using your skill, your tool, will have the right guidance based off what's installed. If you ever build an MCP, you can sometimes find managing versions between agents and harness can be challenging. With a CLI, an agent already knows how to automatically install different versions, use different versions, debug it much more easily and effectively. And the beauty of a CLI too is you can use it too. An agent can summarize your open PRs, tell you which ones are waiting for review, or you can do it yourself. If we look at the GitHub MCP, there are 43 tools in the default tool set. And then if you install everything, that's 87 tools that an agent sees every single time. And so if you design your CLIs in such a way that the skill just invokes the CLI and the agent can discover the commands in the CLI at the right time, you can manage your context better and the agents won't get confused as frequently. About a year ago, a lot of people had to uninstall MCPs so that an agent wouldn't get confused between different MCPs and how they might clash or confuse an agent. Again, you can more easily design a CLI in order to prevent that. So you might be wondering, when should you still use an MCP? There are a lot of reasons why an MCP still might make sense. Not all companies and services have a good CLI, and not all agents have a computer, but MCPs also win from a discovery standpoint. Whether you're trying to find new MCPs or you're trying to get the MCP that you built discovered by other people, MCP has a shared catalog, a marketplace, where it's easy to find and ship your MCP internally or externally. And you kind of need to know that it exists. When you need your services or tools to have the most reach, MCP might be the right choice. Because it is a standard, a lot of new AI applications that are built will have a MCP integration built in. And so it's much easier to get adoption. And so if you're building tooling for your services, for agents, MCPs still might be what you start with. But if you don't need as much of that reach and you care about performance, cost, it might be worth looking into CLIs. If you want to give CLIs a shot, try these today instead. Instead of using the MCPs for Cloudflare, Sentry, Supabase, or if you're using Chrome developer tools, Playwright, browser MCP, you might be able to replace all of them with one CLI. For a lot of people, you just need the most basic tools from some of these services. A CLI that covers 80% of the most commonly used features of Chrome developer tools, Playwright, and browser MCP in agent browser, that might be enough for you. And if you're setting this up today, you don't need to configure anything. You can just tell your agents, replace this MCP server with the CLI, and your agent does the rest. Whether you're using an IDE or a terminal harness, the agents can install the CLI onto your file system. We're still very early. Agent native CLIs are just getting started. People are building factories for CLIs for any service, any website, directly from the APIs. We have Printing Press, which is a library of CLIs that don't have official APIs that you can use. The Open Claude creator has a whole page of CLIs that he builds for his agents. He's even built a tool, a converter, that turns the MCP server into CLIs. Another advantage that the creator of OpenClaw built into a lot of the CLIs is the ability to have the local state advantage, where you can mirror the data that you have in some of these APIs in a SQLite on your file system so that your data is instant and nearly free. This can help out with rate limits, token costs, errors, and this would be much more difficult to do with MCPs. And while you still might use both, for 80% of your agentic use, if your agent has a computer, a CLI might make more sense. And the small chance that you want to build some tools for your agents, your team, your company, and you don't know where to start, a question that could help is, who needs to find and use your tools? If you don't need that level of reach, you might start and build a CLI first. For example, if it's just an internal tooling and it's just a small group of people who use agents on the computer, you could build a CLI in a small skill that is testable. You can version it, faster to iterate on it as you figure out the best way to structure your tools for agentic use. And when you're building CLIs, you have a lot more control over adding explicit for dry runs, approvals, structured output, exit codes, or even managing additional profiles and authentication. So it's easy to switch over between different accounts, profiles. But if you need it to be integrated everywhere, maybe you'll start with the MCP first. You might still want to keep the CLI underneath so that you can make it easy to develop, test, debug, as well as work with many agents and harnesses. Because AI has changed so much within the last year, and it will probably change a lot more in the next year, it's important to use the right tool at the right time. You'll probably still use all three, but if your agent has a computer and a CLI that it can use, it might be the right choice. Just add a little skill on top of it. For any AI application or tools that you built, you'll still need that guidance, that execution, as well as that reach, depending on how far you want it to go. And the skill teaches the agents when and how to use your tools that you make. And in case it wasn't clear, any real team or organization will end up using all three. The skills for the processes, CLIs for execution, and MCPs where things must connect across teams that you don't control. But you might rethink your default. If it's MCP today, it might be worth reevaluating what your default is.